So this is going to be about the effects of the Dutch cultivation system in the island of Java. So for those of you who don't know anything about Indonesia, you'll probably learn more at the end of this course. But Java is the most popular, in addition to, Java is the most populous island in Indonesia. It is has a population of about 160 million or so people. And it's quite densely populated. So it's about the size of New York State with 160 million people. And that's the sort of most populous island in Indonesia today. And it was kind of the heart of so the Dutch were the colonists of Indonesia. It's called the Dutch East Indies. And from the early 1830s to the early 1870s, the Dutch colonial state had forced cultivation for sugar. Okay, and what they did was they basically forced a bunch of villages to grow sugar, whether they wanted to or not. They then, because sugar needs to be pressed and sort of milled into sugarcane very quickly after it's harvested, and it's very heavy. What you do is you build sugar factories kind of near the cane, and you basically process the sugar immediately. And so what they did is they basically built a whole network of sugar factories and then surrounded each of them with villages that were forced to grow cane. Okay, so that's the experience that we're going to study. Okay, so they forced all these villages to grow cane, and they established 94 sugar factories, and they were water powered because this was, of the technology at the time. So they were all located on rivers. And what they did is they basically, in particular, as I mentioned, they established a kind of a radius of around 5 kilometers or so. So this is going to be much finer geographic detail around each of these factories, and forced all the villages within the catchment area to grow sugarcane. Okay, and from the 1860s, we have some reports that say that at some point during this period, this was like over 2.5 million people were forced to sort of provide labor for this. So based on the Mita paper, what would you expect to happen? Yeah, Sarah.
But the northern coast would be significantly less well developed today.
Yeah, exactly. Or in the relevant area. Exactly. The relevant area should be worse off, right? This is not a trick question. That's what we expected too, right? So you'd expect that sort of these areas would be less developed because for all the same reasons we talked about in the Mita paper, they were forced labor, people would go otherwhere, commerce otherwhere. Okay. So this is what we're going to look at here. Okay. So this paper actually is going to do 2 different things. The first is just like the Mita paper, we're going to use a regression discontinuity. Okay, so they drew a radius around each factory. So we're going to figure out where the end of that radius is, and we'll compare villages on one side to villages on the other side. Okay, so it's going to be just like the Mita paper. Okay, so in particular, Melissa found in the Dutch archives in The Hague a list of all of the 10,000 villages that were subject to this restriction. And we typed them into a computer and matched them to modern GIS points. So there's a gazetteer, which actually is maintained by the US military, which basically has just, if you put in a place name, it tells you the GPS coordinates. Okay, so that's pretty handy. You might imagine why the military wants to have that. But they make it open to the public. And so what you can do is you can, so these are the factories. And the dots are places that we found from our historical Dutch list that we could match to modern data. And the gray lines are modern Indonesian villages. So a typical Indonesian village is like a couple of square kilometers. So pretty small. Okay? And we know they're contiguous, so we're just going to draw a line that sort of, and this factory may have bordered that factory, may have bordered this factory. So we're just going to draw a line around any of the subjected factories, and we're going to say that factories inside were part of the system, and factories outside were not part of that system. Okay, is that clear? And this looks we do this all over the coast. It wasn't the whole northern coast, by the way, but it was a bunch of places like that, and there's a few places where it kind of goes inland a bit. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have all of these. That's going to be one border. There's another border, etc. And we're going to run our same kind of border discontinuities, looking at inside and outside. Okay. Now, and if you ever asked about border segment fixed effects, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to divide the borders into little segments. Each color is a different border segment. Okay, so they're pretty tiny. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. The second thing, though, is that's only half the story. You also might say, well, if we want to think of this as a development policy, we actually have to think about these factories, right? And what was the impact of having built all those sugar factories? And so, for that, what we're going to do is we're going to compare areas where the Dutch built factories to areas where the Dutch could have built factories but chose not to. Okay, and in particular, what we know is that basically the Dutch, they had to be on a river. They had to be kind of nearby a bunch of these factories. So we're just going to, I didn't bring a graph with the rivers, but we're going to, so each of these is a factory. We'll sort of take the river network and we'll just, permute the factory up or down the river by a few kilometers and say, well, they could have put a factory here. They could have put a factory here. And we'll compare just basically what's it like to be near where the Dutch happened to put the real factories compared to where they could have put those alternative factories. So here's the impact. So this is a regression I ran of, let me just make sure you understand this. Y equals alpha plus distance to factory. Okay? So a negative coefficient, distance to factory means you're further away. Okay? So this is the impact of being like 1 kilometer away from a factory, 2 kilometers away, 3 kilometers away, and so on. Okay? So what you can see is actually being super close to the factory, those places look really different in today's data. They're much less likely to be in agriculture. 20 percentage points less likely to be in agriculture if you're right at where the factory was, in the 1830s compared to if you're 10 kilometers away. And you're much more likely to be in manufacturing. Like 8 percentage points more likely to be working in manufacturing. You're more likely to be working in retail. You're more likely to have like a high population density. And that's in today's data. You're more likely to have railroads in 1900, roads in 1900, or more likely to have a railroad in 1900. You're more likely to have roads and infrastructure, and both then and today. And you're about 10 percentage points richer. So if we do log consumption, it's 0.1 higher if you're right where the factory is in modern data. Okay, so it looks like if you think about the kind of colonial enterprise, at least the part of which was being near the factory seems to have been very positive for kind of modern economic development. Those places basically turned into kind of cities and manufacturing centers. We can then do the same thing about the same regression discontinuity design and look at the impact of being a subjected village. Right? This is the one that's exactly parallel to the Mita, and we find mostly nothing. But if anything, those places look to have more manufacturing and be, they're not any poorer, right? So their consumption is almost exactly the same. It's 0, and we can rule out a decline of more than 2 standard deviations, so more than about 2%. They look almost the same, and they maybe have a bit more manufacturing. So here's an example where we have an institution that looks kind of similar, and to Sarah's point, when we started this, we sort of thought it looked kind of similar, but in fact was quite different. Okay, and here's an example where, if anything, it looks like these institutions, seem to have been, regardless of how terrible they were for the people at the time, if we look at the long-run implications, they may have been different. So what do you make of all that? So what does that tell you? What do you? Is that surprising? Is it? If so, why? What do you think? Yeah, Kevin.
Why do we believe that the Dutch sort of solved the different sites and then randomly picked the ones to build a factory as opposed to others?
Great question. So you and my referees asked the same question. I think the answer is because we actually know a fair amount of what they looked at. They looked for basically being on a river. They looked for topography and having a fair number of suitable villages nearby. And what we do in the paper, but what I didn't tell you about, is we do this whole complicated thing where we look at alternative sites that look pretty reasonable, and we compare what we found, distance to the actual sites, to distance to those counterfactual sites. So what I showed you was basically just thinking about distance to the actual factory, but what I actually do in the paper is I compare distance to places that look equally plausible to be places where they could have put the factory and didn't. And the results are so stark that it seems pretty reasonable that they're the impacts of the factory. But that's a great question, and one that comes up all the time. Other questions? Does this make you reevaluate kind of what we saw in the Mita paper, or no? No is a fine answer. Yeah, what do you think?
I
feel like not as much reevaluate, but it's also hard to try to draw like parallels between them because it's kind of two different situations.
Okay, so say more.
Like in the Mita, you were displacing people and taking them somewhere else, whereas here the factories were like, pretty close to where they live.
Yeah, they can commute, exactly. They didn't.
And they're also like factories, like, and not just like
Mines.
Yeah, not mines. So you just like different circumstances.
Yep, exactly. So, for example, one thing we talk about in the paper is that manufacturing itself may have had long-run good implications. So it may be that once I start making stuff, I might make more stuff kind of in the future. Absolutely. Other questions?
Because they're close to the coast, close to rivers, so in the
Right.
place they're already places that were more developed, could be more developed.
Yeah, so right. So it could be that, in fact, another thing that's going on is these places were like had a greater propensity for development. The Mita's kind of the Mita places in that plateau in the middle of Peru. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, so to speak. Whereas this is like, there's a zillion people around. It's right near the coast. It's like lots of good stuff can happen here. Absolutely. Other thoughts?
What happened to the price of sugar
When?
after the colonial experience?
Well, it's a longer story than that. So basically, they kept producing sugar up until the 1930s, and then basically they stopped producing most of the sugar. But one thing that's really interesting is actually we see that actually a lot of industries that use sugar as an input, like food, still exist right around where the sugar factories used to be, even though the sugar factories aren't there anymore. And so it's this whole sense of maybe that sort of it provoked development, and that actually kind of continued. So let me actually wrap up because we're out of time. My point of showing you this paper very quickly is, first of all, I didn't go through it nearly the depth we did the Mita paper. My point of this is just that it gets back to this question of sort of what do we take away from this? I think that, in my mind, the Mita paper was very helpful because it showed us one particular channel of institutional persistence, which sort of said, look, we see these big macro level results like on settler mortality or whatever. We think these institutions from hundreds of years ago could have effects. The Mita gave us one plausible set of channels through which that could have happened. I think this paper says, well, gee, let's hold on a second. The colonial experience was very complicated and heterogeneous. I guess we sort of knew that from the settler mortality example. Those were all colonies, and they had heterogeneous experiences. And this paper says, well, even at the micro level, those experiences could be very heterogeneous. And there may have been aspects, and you guys named them, that actually might have meant that even though this may have been bad for the people at the time, it may have had positive kind of long-run development consequences. And so understanding kind of the impacts of colonialism, needs to be pretty nuanced.